to introduce glaciers to us, here we have a whole bunch, a group of people here who have witnessed the largest glacier calving event in history. So they were sitting here 17 days, and on the 17th day, they start to see the glacier starting to calve. And you have to realize how huge this is. They're looking at miles and miles of glacier. This is probably 8-10 miles wide that we're looking at here. Okay, so it's starting. They are on the mountain next to the glacier, and this is not being fast forwarded, but if you just, oh, it's so big. It looks like it's falling slowly because it's so big and it's falling so far. Oh my gosh, they'd be a tiny, tiny, tiny dot. And then they'd be crushed because all of this is going to be flipped and rolling soon.
The calving face is 300, sometimes 400 feet tall. Pieces of ice were shooting up out of the ocean 600 feet and then falling. The only way that you can really try to put it into scale with human reference is if you imagine Manhattan. And all of a sudden, all of those buildings just start to rumble and quake and peel off and just fall over and roll around. This whole massive city just breaking apart in front of your eyes. We're just observers, these two little dots on the side of the mountain. And we watched and recorded the largest witness calving event ever caught on tape.
So how big was this calving event that we just looked at? We'll resort to some illustrations again to give you a sense of scale. It's as if the entire lower tip of Manhattan broke off, except that the thickness, the height of it, is equivalent to buildings that are 2.5 or 3 times higher than they are. That's a magical, miraculous, horrible, scary thing. I don't know that anybody's really seen the miracle and horror of that. It took 100 years for it to retreat 8 miles from 1900 to 2000. From 2000 to 2010, it retreated 9 miles. So in 10 years, it retreated more than it had in the previous 100.
So that was my way of introducing our lesson 3, Erosion by Glacier. So we were just seeing how that Greenland glacier was eroded and, well, how it calved off and made lots and lots of new icebergs. Here's a different glacier. If you look really closely at the picture, these are little tiny people in front of the glacier. Okay? They're very small. This glacier is much larger than you think it is. Well, what is a glacier? A glacier is a mass of snow-covered ice. And there are two different types of glaciers. Those two types of glaciers, the first one is called a continental glacier. Okay? And the biggest one is the continental glacier in Antarctica. Now, NASA's come up with something really nice. It helps to show how the ice is moving in a place like Antarctica. So this is what Antarctica looks like, normally. What they're going to do is put colors on here to show how fast the ice is moving. So this shows where the ice is going. Kind of looks like they're making rivers. So right through here, here's kind of the top of Antarctica. It's all going in different ways, kind of similar to watersheds. If you're snow and you fall here, you go this way. But if you're snow and you fall over here, then you go that way to this glacier. Similar to how watersheds work. So they're draining to different areas. Okay, and you can kind of see how they're moving. Now we're going to zoom in on some ice shelves right here. You can see that the movement is fastest right where all these glaciers come together and vent out into the ocean. Here's larger ice shelves too. So continental glaciers, these are a miles thick layer of ice over an entire continent. Okay, if you're standing here in Antarctica, you've got 2 miles of ice between your feet and the rock of Antarctica. 2 entire miles of ice cover it. So these form over thousands of years of snowfall piling up and then turning into ice. And they're found in the polar areas. So we've been talking about Antarctica, but the glacier we saw at the beginning of the video, that was Greenland. So that's continental glaciers. Now, the other type of glaciers are called valley or Alpine glaciers. This is the other type we've been seeing. Okay. These Alpine glaciers end up looking kind of similar to this. You can see that there was once a glacier that had plowed through here, and it basically removed entire mountains that used to be there, but that glacier bulldozed that whole mountain, this whole mountain range away. Okay. And it left behind these wide-bottomed U-shaped valleys. So here's an Alpine glacier. I'll remind you that they are much bigger than they look in little pictures like this. Last one. So these glaciers can wind up flowing over time. Anyway, here are Valley Alpine Glacier notes. So they are long, slow-moving, wedge-shaped rivers of ice, and they flow down the sides of mountains. It's caused by gravity. So gravity's pulling down on that ice, and it just can't pile up higher and higher and higher. It ends up flowing more like a river than anything else. A very slow-moving river. Lastly, they formed U-shaped valleys, which we saw in some of those pictures just a moment ago. All right, so just to finish up this first page of notes. Okay, how do they move? Well, the immense pressure, there's a ton of pressure in there. It makes the ice melt and refreeze. There's so much pressure, it ends up melting the ice at the bottom, and it refreezes as it goes. Now, there's a second page to this, and we should talk about the Great Lakes. And during the last ice age, so over these time periods, as the ice was receding, the Great Lakes formed at the edge, formed at the end of the last ice age. Basically, water filled in these great big basins that the glaciers left behind. And that's how we got the Great Lakes. You know, if the Great Lakes had formed differently, then our country would look differently. The border between the United States and Canada would be different if these had been smaller or even larger. Okay, last two things I want you to know. Okay, now there's this word shows up in the state standards, moraines. We see moraines around here. Now, if this is a glacier, this is the very end of the glacier. If we move over a little bit, you know, starts in the mountains, flows down, flows down, flows down. Now you see these little tiny black rocks. These specks are flowing down. These are rocks. And as those rocks flow down, what ends up happening to them down here? Yeah, they pile up. It's a form of deposition. And when these rock piles pile up, they're called moraines. Okay? So these rock piles of loose gravel, boulders, rocks, things that are carried by glacier, we see these in Minnesota. We see these all around us. And they're evidence of where the glacier dropped off all of the stuff that we, little random hills that we have around here, can be moraines from those glaciers. Now the last thing here on the notes are glacial lakes. Okay. Now, glacial lakes, if we have a glacier receding, going back, hunks of ice are going to break off, and there's going to be a lot of sediment as these glaciers melt. So what ends up happening is you have this big, big, big hunk of ice. Okay, and if it gets buried in sediment, and all this other sediment builds up around it, well, that's going to slow the ice from melting, first of all. It's going to take longer to melt. But when it does melt, it's going to leave kind of a hole. And that hole ends up being a lake. So the boundary waters up in northern Minnesota, all of these lakes seem to have formed when hunks of ice were just left behind when those glaciers were retreating, and left behind little depressions in the land. So all of these lakes are glacial lakes. So glacial lakes, as glaciers recede, the blocks of ice are buried in sediment and leave holes in the ground. That's the end of these notes.